and from the geographic area where the disease was first recognized, in Old Lyme, Connecticut. Caused by a spirochete, it was ultimately given the name Borrelia burgdorferi, spread by bites from deer ticks. After its recognition in North America, it's been found in Europe and Asia, so it has a global distribution. These are the ticks that we associate, the deer ticks that transmit the disease. Outbreaks first identified in the 1970s led to recognition of the disease. The organism was described by Dr. Bergdorf. The name, where'd it go, right here, Burgdorferi, the species name, is in honor of his first isolation of the organism. The characteristic clinical presentation is right here. See this round red lesion on the front, the shin of this individual? In up to 3/4 of the cases of Lyme disease, at the site of the tick bite, and that would be the center of this round lesion, these sorts of what are referred to as target lesions develop. That is, they migrate outwards, the center starts to clear because that's the oldest part of the lesion. And that is the first symptom associated with Lyme disease. As a result of the organism being inoculated from the tick bite, there's systemic symptoms, fever, myalgia, malaise, etc., that all develop that kind of flu-like constellation of symptoms. This is the Borrelia, the spirochete organism. Transmitted by ticks. We talked about the disease being first recognized in outbreaks in Old Lyme, Connecticut. Dr. Bergdorf, University of Wisconsin, was in another endemic area for Lyme disease. You look at the prevalence, and Lyme, Connecticut is right in the center of the New England endemic area for the disease. Endemic meaning the local or the naturally occurring distribution of the disease. And then the Great Lakes area is the other part of where the disease is, where ticks are normally infected. So most disease is found in those two parts of the United States. Adults, nymphs, female, male, adult ticks. At one time I could identify all those different stages because during my clinical training, I spent 6 weeks at the Texas State Public Health Laboratory. And for 3 days, I went through a program with their field epidemiologists who go out into the field, collect a variety of samples. And in Texas, one of the common diseases are the tick-borne diseases. In knowing the type of tick, you can predict what type of disease may be at increased prevalence during that upcoming season. So what they do is they go out into rural areas and they would drag for ticks. They've got this big device that's similar to a big blanket that they would run through the vegetation, collect the ticks, and then look at them under the microscope, determine the species, genus and species, and then from that they could predict the type of disease that was most likely to be more prevalent in the upcoming season. So typically this was done in the early spring. New England being a focus for Lyme disease. On one of our vacations, my wife and I were at Martha's Vineyard, hiking across the dunes to the waterfront, and we came across this sign that, being the microbiology geek that I am, I had to take a picture. Lyme disease prevention. On your way to the beach, make sure you tuck your pants into your socks. Use your tick repellent. Stay on the trail. Well, stay on the trail was the easy part.
What's a tick repellent? What is it?
There are insecticides that will affect mosquitoes, ticks, that sort of thing. And then this just gives you an idea of the, they actually look like a pinhead. They're so small. Typical symptoms associated with Lyme disease: the target lesion in most cases. Unfortunately, up to 25% of cases that don't have that characteristic lesion are much more difficult to diagnose. And untreated cases of Lyme disease can lead to antibody production against the Borrelia, the spirochete. And of those undiagnosed patients, then, chronic disease can develop. And in the approaching half of those patients with chronic disease, the antibody causes a reaction in joints and causes an arthritic reaction. So chronic arthritis associated with undiagnosed Lyme disease is a potential. This just gives you a relative idea of the size of the tick compared to the proverbial pinhead. And that is an engorged tick. That's a tick that's already had a blood meal. So the tick before it's actually attached is going to be about, maybe a quarter that size. And then this is the target lesion that develops with the bite would have originated in the middle of that lesion. Because this is a bacterial infection, it can be treated with antibiotics. Prevention, tick bites, antibiotics then are most effective, again, like most of these diseases, in early diagnosis. Another arthropod, different one than we've talked about. We've talked about lice and ticks, now we're going to talk about mosquitoes as vectors for a protozoa. We've talked about viruses and bacteria. Mosquitoes can transmit the protozoa that causes the disease malaria. Transmitted by a specific species of mosquitoes. So it's not transmitted by all mosquitoes. Actually, this is a genus, not a species. I misspoke. So the disease is only prevalent where that particular vector is prevalent, just like our tick-borne diseases. Those that are associated with particular types of ticks, that disease is only found where those ticks are prevalent. That's why Lyme disease has its geographic focus. New England and the Great Lakes, because the deer tick that commonly transmitted is prevalent in those two areas and not throughout other parts of the country. Likewise, then, we find malaria in tropical and subtropical latitudes where the Anopheles mosquitoes are prevalent. In terms of global disease, malaria, tuberculosis, diseases of sanitation are those that are of most public health significance. Globally, 1 million people a year is estimated die from malaria. Not being in an endemic area, that, at least to me, that number is staggering. We think of malaria as something that, is out there, but to kill 1 million people a year, that's, and the parts of the world that are infected are those that have the least amount of resources, both economic and resources in terms of medical support, food, clean water, etc. So those individuals are compromised in terms of their nutrition, their immunologic state, etc. Prevention by preventing mosquito bites, individuals traveling to areas where the disease is common can take medication to prevent that infection. We'll talk a little bit more about that. In the United States, there are relatively few cases of malaria, and all but a handful of those cases are all acquired by travel, and then the individual returns home and is diagnosed with malaria. We'll talk about how that happens. You can prevent that by taking drugs appropriately.
Oh, glad you clarified that.
No, I mean the anti-malarial drugs being taken appropriately. And we'll talk about what that means in just a second. There are certain populations that have natural immunity because the protozoan affects red blood cells, erythrocytes. Individuals that have sickle cell trait, again an effect on the red blood cell, have a resistance to malaria.
Huh, that's interesting.
It has to do with some of the surface components on the red blood cell.
It can't hear.
Well, it's not just the shape, but it's the actual chemistry of the membrane.
Yeah. Huh.
Because then you have, most people in those areas have sickle cell trait on one side. So they're not like we think where they have sickle cell anemia. So when they get it from both parents, they start
They
presenting
don't
actually.
actually have this syndrome. At one time, malaria was endemic in the United States. And in fact, the Anopheles mosquito was found outside of the subtropical latitudes. But due to mosquito control, it's been largely eliminated. In fact, the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta started out as a malaria control public health facility. Once they did their job so well, rather than putting themselves out of business, their mission was expanded to not just malaria, but to infectious diseases in general. So it was eliminated from the continental United States in the late 1940s due to mosquito control measures. And there are ongoing mosquito control measures. Any of you that have lived in the South during the spring and summer, there'll be trucks, helicopters that are spraying insecticides to control mosquitoes. When I was on the Gulf Coast of Texas, you'd see helicopters flying over the bayou spraying insecticides to minimize the mosquito populations in those stagnant, static waters.